Welcome to the Embodiment podcast. This show is for you if you see the body as more than a brain taxi. It's for people interested in coming home to the body as a holistic aspect of who we are and how we live. Episodes contain practical tips, exercises you can take away, and interviews with specialists from around the world. I'm your host for today, Maud Rabert. And today I'm most happy to welcome Karine Bell, calling us from Solothurn, Switzerland. Karine, welcome.
Thank you, Maud. Thank you so much. I'm glad to be here.
So, Karine, you are an American.
That's right. I am. Yeah.
Chicago. You live now in Switzerland with your husband and your two children.
Mm-hmm.
And you're a somatics educator as well as a mindfulness instructor. And your work is mostly oriented towards mamas, offering really embodied work. And this is also work that's strongly grounded in culture. And I know you're an anthropologist.
Mm-hmm.
So really juicy things to discuss with you today. Thank you for being with us.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
So today I would like you to maybe introduce yourself. What is it that we should know about your work? What stands out? What would you say is your purpose or contribution today?
You know, for me, I think fundamentally, and this is everything that I do for my work, and I can imagine this is true for a lot of people who work in embodiment and somatics, that this is very much also a personal journey for me. It's been a journey for me to find a way back into a relationship with myself that was completely different than how I'd been taught from the time I was a young child. And given the family I grew up in, given the culture I grew up in. And I think, you know, all of the learning that I've done over the course of my life, just being very interested and curious about the nature of what it means to be human, and of course, studying anthropology as a consequence, and ending up getting into mindfulness and embodiment work is culminating, I think, in this, you know, very strong desire to share what I've learned around what it means to come back into a relationship of trust again with our bodies. And for me as a mother, I think fundamentally that was at heart was what was most important for me, was to learn how to trust myself again and to really be in connection with myself again, and learn how to parent from that place, if that makes sense. So, you know, the parenting guides away. I mean, there's a lot of information out there in the world, but if things are incoherent here, you know, in our bodies, if there's a lot of stuff going on that we just have not worked with, it's going to be very difficult, if not impossible, to implement all of those, even all of the wonderful advice, not to mention the advice that maybe isn't so wonderful out there around parenting and how we should do that. So I think fundamentally what my big desire, it's less focused on how to parent. It's much more focused on how to help, how to teach others how to, you know, to trust themselves and to learn to become very grounded and rooted in their own bodies and to trust themselves to parent from that place.
Beautiful.
Does that make sense?
It totally does. And what I understood discussing with you prior to this interview was that your work, working with mothers around the embodied transformational experience of motherhood, is strongly rooted in your own experience, right?
Absolutely.
And you often mention that your own mother has been one of your greatest teachers in your own, I guess, experience of growing up with her. Would you like to share a little bit about that?
Yeah, I'd love to. You know, I talk about my mom a lot on my own podcast and in my own journey. And my mom passed away a few years ago now. But I do talk about her as my greatest teacher. And I think the reason for that is, you know, I grew up in a very disorganized, extremely dysfunctional, and very abusive environment, actually. It was, you know, I had a mother who was very herself dealing with a lot of traumas that were unresolved. And I think even at the time, I don't even know until the day she died if any of the experiences that she had in her own life were ever attributed actually to the traumas she experienced in her early life. I mean, she had some of the more obvious traumas, but she also had kind of the trauma of what they call the things that weren't done, not the things that happened, but the things that didn't happen, right? So all of the ways that she wasn't seen and heard and understood, and some of the experiences that she had were denied and pushed down. She experienced extreme sexual assault at a very, very young age, and it was kind of covered over. She lived in a small town in Wisconsin, and it was the culture at the time that you just didn't talk openly about something like that. Everyone knew everyone else, and the people who had done it were, respected members of the community. And so that's a burden she had to bear then, and within her body, she had to kind of internalize that and just not talk about it. It became this very dark secret in her life. And there were, several of those types of things that she had to deal with. And as a consequence, she, when I was growing up with her, she struggled a lot with mental illness. She was diagnosed bipolar disorder. She was diagnosed with borderline personality disorder. She had a host of autoimmune diseases. And we now know, of course, the link between, the ACEs study, for example, has shown the link between early adverse childhood experiences and the later development of mental illness and physical health problems. I mean, she fits that model that's kind of emerging more now to a T, But when I was growing up, none of that was kind of in the realm of, mainstream understanding. And she was also herself a psychiatric nurse, which meant that she had very much this sort of inculcated medical view of the world, where the body was for her very much like a machine, like a car, and each piece had a doctor for it, and you would take the body to this doctor to deal with this piece of the puzzle, and another doctor to deal with this piece of the puzzle, and this sort of more holistic view of the body and the individual, the person who has a history, a personal history, and also a cultural history, the transgenerational link. None of that was considered, I think, when she would sit in front of a doctor or in front of her psychiatrist. None of that was, that whole picture was not taken into consideration, and the effects of these different aspects of her experience on how she experienced her life. And I think that was one thing, but then, beyond that, that was the environment that I grew up in, which meant that not only did she medicalize all of her experience, everything that she experienced was attributed to genetics or some kind of biological just dysfunction of her body. And so that's what was then attributed to me. And it became this thing where, when I was growing up, where, I was responding as a child does, responding to the environment in which I was living, and responding with my behavior in ways that I couldn't vocalize, so maybe a child acts out because they're not getting essentially what they need in terms of being nourished and being attended to and being cared for. And they're maybe acting out with their behavior. And then this medical model comes in and says, well, the problem is we need to give this pill, or they have ADHD, or they have this, and this is why their behavior is like this. I don't know that anyone came in and said, well, let's look at the environment, or, let's look at this basic need of a child for connection. What is it that my physiology as a child was responding to in relationship to this, very kind of chaotic early upbringing. So I was very curious about that. I think even as a young child, even though I didn't have the intellectual capacity to kind of, think logically about what was going on, there was always this part of me that had that was really curious about this link between, for example, her illnesses and stressful events in her life, and how I would see the impact of one on the other. And it was, for me, over time, I think it became very clear. And she was like, her whole life became like a laboratory for me. I was so curious about it, and curious about understanding it.
Thank you, Karine, for sharing your own story. So openly. I know you talk a lot as well in your work around the trauma of insecurity and how those early childhood experiences that are more or less nourishing can shape our own relationship to how in turn we can be a mother, right?
Yes, absolutely. I think one of the things that I learned through my early experience with my mother was, as a child, you have this biological need. We know this in attachment theory, right? That children, out of survival, their attachment to the adults around them, to their mom, to their dad, or to their primary caregivers, that need will eclipse our need for authenticity. It will eclipse any other need that we have because it's so primary. We are so biologically wired to feel our attachment to them that we'll do whatever that we can or whatever we need to do to maybe modify our behavior in a way that maybe pleases our mom or dad. Or, one example I like to give a lot is, all the ways that a child will modify themselves. For example, if you have a parent who hasn't been taught how to deal with their own emotional world, who hasn't been taught emotional resilience, and the language of emotions, and really understanding how to be in relationship to their own emotional world. A lot of times that parent, and my mom was a good example of this, in ways that I think she was definitely unaware, she would make me responsible for her emotional well-being. So anytime a parent, for example, is like, you stop crying, I can't handle your tears, I can't handle you being upset. These very subtle ways that this consistent, or this kind of dynamic that gets set up between a mother and a child, or a father and a child, where the child learns over time that how they are, no matter how authentic it is in that moment, might cause the parent to become upset in some way. And that feels threatening for the child. It feels threatening for the parent to have a negative reaction from the parent based on what a child is experiencing. And I think as a result of that, we learn different ways of being able to deal with that. And one of the ways is that we might learn to stop tuning into the language of the body, I like to say, all of the many impulses that arise in us. For example, the impulse to cry when we're sad, which is very natural, especially for a child who's still in connection with that before it's conditioned out of them. It's very natural to feel the impulse to cry when we feel it, and to cry. And we know that, the action of crying, the behavior, the embodied experience of crying helps, it's part of the parasympathetic nervous system, helping to settle an aroused state. And I probably don't even need to tell you that in so many cultures that we are living in, that we know of, the ability for a child to cry freely is often stifled. A parent will often, shush a child or tell them to stop crying, either because it's too much for them or it's culturally not acceptable. And so my fundamental, so my belief is that really over time we have this learned disconnection from the body. We have a learned disconnection from the very natural animal instincts, impulses, the feeling states, the emotional world, the language, the world of the body. We become disconnected from that experience, really in a very fundamental way, just through the dynamics that we're in, the environments that we exist within as children.
So literally learned disembodiment, right?
Absolutely. It's a learned, and I really believe that. And I would say that the majority of people that I've met and worked with have this to some degree or another, where we have this learned disembodiment. And then on top of that, there is this, and what it gets replaced with is this very antagonistic relationship then to the body, because we don't understand the body. And so we're relating into it from a very different place. It's this kind of top down, what's going on down there, things are going wrong. Spark plugs are coming out, coming out from the engine. I got to go get this thing fixed. This is very much the culture I grew up in. Instead of understanding that the body has a wisdom and an intelligence to it and a capacity to heal, and that there is fundamentally, and I've had to learn this over time, that there is a way in which when we connect to the body that we can trust this organic unfolding, that we will be led, very naturally, given certain ingredients, that the body will find regulation again. It will find capacity and space again.
And I know, Karine, that your work is also very much around supporting mothers rewire their nervous system so they can also process all of that learned disembodiment and all those narratives and beliefs that have become embodied, right?
That's right.
Another dimension you're also working with is trauma as another layer of experience that becomes embedded in the flesh and the body. Would you like to say a bit more about that?
Sure. It's interesting because I think my own relationship with the word trauma has been evolving, and I have to admit that it's still evolving in a way, because I sort of hover I hover on this line between really embracing this idea of trauma. I completely embrace it in one sense. And yet the only way I really feel comfortable talking about trauma is to make sure that the piece where we talk about the path back from trauma is seen and understood. Does that make sense to you? So, trauma is very much, we know one of my favorite definitions is anything that was too much, too soon, or too fast for us to be able to process, to integrate, to metabolize, anything that overwhelmed what resources we had available to us. And, when I was growing up, I had, even of course, according to the ACE study, I had multiple points on the ACE study that I could check off. And growing up, I always thought, well, the reason I am the way I am, or the reason I'm, I have dysfunctional relationships, or I really struggle in life, is because of my traumas. But then it would happen that I would meet people all the time from really great childhoods, right? I mean, really all the time, who were getting into just as dysfunctional relationships as I was, and who were overcome with just as much self-doubt or insecurity, fundamental insecurity. And I just thought to myself, what is going on? Like, what is that all about? And that's what really made me want to try to link this idea of, there's what the trauma of the things that are unseen that are deeply cultural. So, for example, one of the things I talk about quite a lot is like this experience of a child, the ability, or let me put it this way, the ability of a parent to validate a child's perception. So, for example, I'm trying to give you an example that's not rooted in an actual trauma, because I have one from a sexual abuse perspective. But, anytime a child, for example, has an experience that feels big and scary and overwhelming, and they're very activated from that, right? How we respond to that little person when they're experiencing what they're experiencing, I think is going to matter. It's going to shape how they themselves will in turn relate to that. So let's say my little boy once, felt this irrational, quote unquote, meaning there was no reason in the environment for it, but he was scared of, the dark, or there was something, he was scared of something like a monster or something. Now, one of the things that's really important to me is this idea of bringing equanimity into how we respond to our children. So, a parent's ability to fully see and really create this space within which the child feels understood. No matter how illogical the adult brain that we are, that we're functioning often from is saying, there's nothing to be scared of. There's nothing to be scared of. It's all in your head. Mm-hmm. We're not able in that way to to really validate that there's something happening for them in that moment. It doesn't have to be based on anything real. There's just something that's happening within the world of their bodies in that moment. And I think there's a way that we can respond to that neither shuts it down and says, that's nothing, ignore it. Nor does it,
emotional needs, right? Mm-hmm.
What's that?
Because of my emotional needs.
Exactly. Right? And how common is that? I can't handle you being irrational right now. I need my time and space, and you need just to deal with your fear. And in these very small ways, we're not able to then attend to this what feels like a very real experience for the child, right? They feel that fear. And what they really need from us is the ability to connect, to feel understood, but also to have, we also have the ability as the person, as the adult person with perspective, to both connect and hold that broader perspective. We also know there is no monster in the room. And so I think we can bring that kind of energy to a child who's experiencing a situation like that, when we can bring it with equanimity. And I think really these are the kinds of traumas that I think the majority of us have experienced. I mean, I come, like I said, from a background that has quite a lot of other trauma in it, but I still think that the majority of the people that I meet every day and I work with every day have these kinds of traumas. These are, in my opinion, these are emotional. These create the experience of an emotional trauma where they're not able to fully be able to process and to be with emotional experiences that felt overwhelming to them.
So what I'm hearing from you is that there is a possibility to relate to trauma that maybe is less, I should venture to say, deterministic, that maybe your mother related to them, maybe a way that's more empowering. Would you say that?
Yeah, for me, that is so fundamentally important. I can't even tell you. I mean, I'll give you a little bit more personal information. I grew up, I experienced sexual abuse for the first 12 years of my life from 4 different people, in primary caregivers, really very traumatic for a child to experience. But there was something, I have to say, when you have an experience like that, and then what you hear, I was in therapy from the time I was a young child, and all I would hear is how damaging it is, how fundamental your life has changed, how broken you are, how you ruin people's life, how your life is ruined. And I would hear that reflected in my environment everywhere. And that created a rebellion in me. I'm not going to lie. I was like, no, if there's anything that I have fought for my entire life, it's the ability to determine my experience and not to be, pigeonholed or contained within someone else's perception of how my life should feel or be experienced. And I was very, I always say it a lot, but I can be very stubborn like that, and my stubbornness really, I think, fueled this kind of fight, if I can, and really it is, I mean, there is a fight energy in a way, but I think in a positive sense, it was a mobilization and a motivation to really always try to find a way that didn't have me in this prison of someone's perception, right? An abused person is always going to have this kind of life. It robs you of your innocence forever. I disagree with that. I disagree with that because I've had a different experience. I've fought for my ability in a positive way. I've been able to learn how to work and to connect again with my body in such a way that I know exactly what innocence feels like still. I know how to connect to wonder and joy, and I know what it means to be playful and spontaneous again. All these things that innocence involves that they say is completely lost to you once you've gone through an experience like that. And my experience is something else. It says, there's this idea, of course, post-traumatic growth. My experience is much more like that. It's like, yes, there were these very sort of groundbreaking or earth-shattering experiences at different points in my life. There's no question. And I think everyone has a handful of these to varying degrees. But really, it's in how we're going to relate to those experiences, whether we shut down or avoid or live forever in a dissociated state, to try to not finally go in and recover those lost elements of ourselves. Or we do that, right? Or we decide we want this relationship with self again. And I think at first, hinges a bit on whether or not we believe that's possible. And I hope that an experience like mine could be a positive, that I could share a story that would inspire other people to believe that is possible. It absolutely is possible.
Thank you, Karine. I can definitely hear how your own alignment and your own work on that is the core of everything you offer, right?
Oh yeah, so much. I don't know if I could do it any other way, Maud. I really don't.
So then I get curious, because when we come back to your example, you just mentioned, and also the other example we've had before of that little boy and the monster, or any traumatic experience for that matter. If we go to the body right now, and how would you say the healing actually happens, and how is it related to the body? How would you say can connection to the body awaken healing, support healing?
In my own experience and in the work that I like to do, for me, it's very much about, one of the things that happens when we have, as probably these, a lot of these unresolved experiences of trauma is that, we are often living in either a shutdown state, and behind that shutdown state, there's often a lot of still flight energy within us, or we're living in a very activated, very hypervigilant, anxious state. And we can actually become, especially if we haven't had the experiences we needed as a child to be able to learn about and to relate to our emotional worlds, and to learn how to express emotion in a healthy and positive way. We can actually grow up to become very fearful of our own bodies and what's happening inside of them, right? And this was me for a long time. When you have a lot of anxiety in your body, I would sit on meditation retreats. My first meditation experience was a 10-day silent retreat. I was about 22 years old. And I remember what it felt like to try to sit, and not have my mind go away from my body, which I was so used to doing because it felt much safer than actually feeling what I was feeling in my body at the time. All of the anxiety, all of the areas of tension holding. And, I didn't know anything about, procedural memory or implicit memory and how the body holds those things at the time. I just knew the body felt like a scary place to be. I learned that through meditation, and I didn't know how to work with it, in that sense. And I think for me, over time, what this has been, it's been like this very beautiful slow dance, between our awareness, our ability to cultivate this awareness of the body that is like an invitation again to reconnect. It's like I have this sense, I really had this very profound sense once that what I was doing was learning, to help my body learn to trust that I'm safe, right? And so showing up for myself in the way that I would have needed someone to show up for me as a child. They say in attachment parenting that you don't need to get it right 100% of the time to have a secure attachment, but you need to show up. It only needs to be around 30% of the time, but just being there, right? Just being willing to be a witness. This is another thing from Peter Levine, you probably knows the somatic experiencing, the creator of somatic experiencing. He said, trauma is not what happens to us, it's what happens in the absence of an empathetic witness, right? And that we're learning to become, I had to learn to become my own empathetic witness through the cultivation of awareness and the ability to sort of disengage the fear around what was happening in my body. And it's a slow, it's a slow dose kind of way in. You don't bulldoze your way in, right? Because there's a reason there's a boundary there. There's a reason why there's a shutdown there, because we're protecting ourselves, even from ourselves sometimes. We had our boundaries bulldozed a lot as children. And so we can't then bulldoze our own boundaries when we're trying to reestablish this connection to ourselves. But it's a slow invitation. It's like a slow dance. It's so beautiful to me. It's like, how long can I be in there? How long can I stay within this body? What can I sense in the body, and how long can I be with that sensation that feels really scary? And while I'm there, does it shift or change? And oh, look, it does. When I actually stay with it, this knot that was in the center of my chest is suddenly expanding, and oh, look, it's not a knot anymore. It's sadness. It's grief. And behind it is this impulse to cry, and then maybe I'll cry. And there's something so exquisitely beautiful in that to me. This ability to reconnect and to trust the life of the body again. But I think it is a slow process, and it is one that I have had to learn how to tread carefully. And because of course you're inviting in to come up to awareness things that you've spent a lifetime trying to avoid, right? All that pain.
So what I'm hearing about you is that this parenting experience of becoming a mother probably is this experience of becoming this empathetic inner parent, right, to yourself and to the child. Would you say so?
No doubt. There's no question. And I think it was a realization that I had pretty early on when I was never one of those young ladies who was really excited about parenting and envisioned my wedding day and couldn't wait. I was never that person. Never. I think if anything, I was the opposite. I didn't really know if I wanted children. For sure. But I think behind that uncertainty was a lot of fear and doubt. Can I even do that? And like I said, it wasn't something I consciously thought about. But once I did have children, and I had children with an incredible human being, and that's a story in itself. But I had children with this incredible human being, and I remember being suddenly a mother. It all happened quite quickly. I was a mother. I had 2 kids in 2 years. And I was standing one day at the bank of a river here in Switzerland. We had gone out for the day. And I remember my husband had the kids for a moment, and I was walking up and down this river, and I was just overwhelmed with anxiety. I was crawling out of my skin. And I remember just repeating this phrase over and over in my head: I can't be responsible for these humans. I can't be responsible. I can't be responsible. And I think it really terrified me to the core of this idea that I didn't know how to parent. I didn't have a model for parenting. I didn't have the experience of being parented in the way that I sensed I knew I wanted to parent. I just didn't know how. I didn't know what that would take or what it would look like. I knew it wouldn't look like, I knew it wouldn't come from the books. I knew that wasn't enough. I knew it wasn't about reading advice books. It was something much more fundamental to that. And I really asked myself, how can I learn to trust myself, to know how to respond to my children and their needs? How can I trust myself to respond in ways that really could nourish and allow them to thrive in the way that I wanted them to be able to thrive as human beings. So I had to figure out what that would be for me, right? I had to figure out, what does that mean? What does that even mean to me? And I think there's this really beautiful quote that goes, when you get the what, then you know the how. So, that was really then a process of learning, what is it that I, as a human being, what do I fundamentally need? Or what is it that those parts of me, right? And I think part of it was very much about identifying through the practices that I started to engage with, identifying these aspects of myself. I like to talk about, people might call it an inner child, but there are very much these kind of energetic felt experiences that when I gave them like an age, I would know exactly what they were about, just the felt sense experience of them, right? Oh, I feel 7. I feel 7 right now, I would say, and it was so helpful for me to do that kind of learning with myself, because that knowledge was power in that sense, because when you're aware of something, alive in your something alive in your experience in that moment, then you have much more choice in how you're going to respond to that. So I don't want my 7-year-old to parent my children, right? Like the 7-year-old part of me is emotionally unstable, maybe has a lot of emotional needs. And if I'm not careful, the emotional neediness of maybe my 7-year-old, the part of me that's not able to regulate my own emotional state, might make my children responsible for my own emotions, right? Like if I'm feeling overwhelmed because I can't handle what I'm feeling, then I might make it your responsibility to change how you are in some way so that I can feel just a little bit better. But instead of doing that, I can hold that, I can contain that, I can say, I can see what's happening right now, and I can be with that without it coming out in my dynamic with my children.
So, Karine, I remember you mentioned before in the nightmare story of the monster story, the quality of equanimity that you support parents, and in particular mothers, develop in themselves so that they can handle all of that. How would you say your own embodied practices supported you to develop that quality in yourself? What is the how in the body of that process?
I think it's very much about learning how to, through awareness of the body, how to regulate our states, our internal states. Learning how to notice, first of all, become aware of the state of the body at any given time. So maybe our activated states, and then also to feel that we have the resources and the ability to begin the work of regulating those states, so that we're able to find more groundedness, we're able to find more centeredness, we're able to just find a sense of that equanimity, we're able to find a balanced state through really working with the body. So really down-regulating, like I said, very activated states is one really powerful way to learn to trust that actually we can be with our experiences. We can increase our capacity to feel our feelings and the bigness of our feelings. We can increase our capacity to be with sensation, no matter how strong that sensation is. We increase our capacity to be with strong emotions, no matter how scary they might have felt at first, because we weren't used to being with them before. That anger that felt so big and monstrous, we learn how to bring the space around it. We learn how to be able to hold it and contain it in a way that we feel safe to feel it.
And so I know you're one of the few professionals who actually practice at the crossroads of trauma and mindfulness, right? And currently with the publication of the book by David Treleaven around trauma-sensitive mindfulness, the conversation has expanded around how can we practice connection to the body in a way that's not re-traumatizing,
yes,
but support healing and reconnection. What would you say are the ways of practicing that support this healthy trauma-sensitive reconnection to the body?
I think it's a great question. It's a very, very important question, because I think before I specifically answer that, just to give you a little bit of background, I think that's part of the reason why I really started to embrace more the word trauma and want to understand more about the physiology of trauma and the biology of trauma, because, my work, I've been meditating for many, many years, Buddhist meditation, but then I've been a mindfulness teacher now for several years, and I would notice in my courses just how often people were coming, like I said, everyday people with very functional lives in many ways, maybe even very high positions in corporations, or they'd come from all sections, or all sectors, but then they would come to the space and as you start to build awareness through mindfulness, very naturally, of course, things are going to start to come up to the surface. And how do you meet that experience? There was a publication that came out a while ago, and I'm forgetting the name of the author, but it was on the dark side of mindfulness. And I thought that it was a little bit misleading in a sense, but it was also a very important topic, because it's a cautionary tale for people who want to start to do work with these kinds of practices, to allow them to do what they can do, which is really, change our lives in many ways and help us find more balance. We are also going to start creating the space that's needed for some of the older stuff to come up. And if we're not careful, it can overwhelm us very, very quickly. I personally had a few experiences of that happening. I was able to work with it, but it can be very scary to be suddenly confronted with, a very old and powerful memory rising to the surface during your practice. And so I think it's incredibly important that the mindfulness practitioner is able to work with people in very individual ways, sometimes even within a group, to number one, and this is something that people bypass all the time, is to number one, give people permission to know when they need to stop or leave, or, and I mean, first of all, even getting people to the point where they can know and recognize that boundary is, I think, already beautiful. It's already a huge, huge thing. People will stay sitting in a group filled with anxiety and near panic just because they think they have to, that's what they were taught. So that's one of the first things I tell people in my mindfulness work. And the next thing I do is I point out the importance of this dance. I point out the importance of this very slow and steady, this kind of dance that we do between touching into the body, touching into experiences that are maybe scary or painful, and then pulling out whenever we need to. And we always give ourselves permission to do that. We touch in when it feels safe again. And we find that over time, we can go further and further, deeper and deeper. We can stay a little bit longer than we did the day before, or the week before, or the year before. And over time, we realize suddenly that we have much more capacity and resilience. But this isn't, of course, necessarily going to happen in 8 weeks, is it? In an 8-week mindfulness course by any means. But I think if you can introduce these concepts, and really have those be the most fundamental ones that you could learn or take away from those 8 weeks, then I think the practice can continue with those in mind. I'm learning this ability to be with myself in a new way, but that's going to take a little bit of time and patience and a willingness to stay with my experience, and a willingness to pull out when I need to.
So right now you're talking about how you support people building this capacity, right, to relate to the body more and more skillfully and in a safe way. Does it happen to you sometimes that you would deepen the work from the mindfulness field towards your somatic experiencing practice, or are there ways that you've found yourself using both dimensions of your work with certain individuals?
Oh, no doubt. Yeah. Even in my mindfulness courses, I bring somatic experiencing into them now. I can't help it. There's so much beauty in it. There's really so much beauty for me in that model. And I'm not a purist by any stretch. I will draw from any modality that I think could provide some healing in some way, if it seems right in that moment for that to be brought in. But I'll even bring some somatic touch, like Kathy Kane's work, into the mindfulness realm, and without explicitly talking about it, right? Just maybe, introducing the idea of what would it be like, to try this motion where we hold the hand on the heart space and notice how that feels, what happens, or is there a particular area on the chest where you feel something shift or change? What do you notice when you have your hand here? I think these are very small ways that you just start to reintroduce people to themselves, right? really reintroduce people to themselves in a way that they've just never been taught to know themselves in this way. And I think it's so beautiful, and it's so moving to see how deeply the shifts that are possible, even within a relatively short amount of time, in just this, with these very, very small these very, very small teachings, or these small opportunities just to experience themselves in a new way.
Thank you. I know, Karine, that some of your work as well, and you've done even a TED talk on that topic, is around the embodiment of culture and how, and I suppose it comes also from your own story, and as you shared before, how some narratives have been embedded throughout the generations into how we show up, maybe even specifically as women. Would you like to say a bit more about that?
Yeah, I mean, that's quite a big piece, and my mind is kind of going in a few different ways. But the TED Talk, for example, I was talking about the birth experience I had with my daughter, and I had, of course, two births, and the first one was very much, I really wanted it to be a natural birth experience. And it wasn't it didn't have to be a certain way. It wasn't like that. It was more, I wanted to know what it would be like to trust the body to do what I really believed the body could do. It was built to birth children. This was a belief I had, right? Well, the situation was that, things happened very quickly, and there were circumstances outside of my control, and it ended up being a very medicalized birth and with a lot of intervention. And there were a few moments, and I'm very grateful in many ways for what medicine can do for us, what modern medicine can do. I would never say that I'm against it. I work with doctors as well. But there was a part of me that thought, what would have happened if I had made a few of choices differently during that experience? There were a few moments where I think I could have said, well, wait a minute, I'd like to just see what would happen, if we waited a little bit longer, but I realized I didn't trust myself enough. I got scared, and I just let the intervention happen. And that's okay. I don't regret anything, and I don't feel, guilty about it. It was fine. But then when I was pregnant with my daughter, I realized I wanted to try again. And I was so intrigued with this idea that, how we are responding to what the body is doing is very much going to determine what the body does. So, I was so curious about this one experience I had, which I think you might have heard already, but when I was sitting one day on the sofa, and I could feel this Braxton Hicks contraction start to happen. I could feel the hardening of my belly start to take place. And I noticed that in very, very subtle ways, I was tensing around it. I was tensing around this contraction that didn't even hurt. And it made me really wonder about that. Like, it was a very automatic response. And I realized, when I looked into it, that there's such a culture of, and this goes back to what I was saying about having the perception of the people around us determine what our experience will be, that this applies to culture. The narratives that culture is telling us, for example, in mental health, that if the culture is saying that the body is it's like a machine, and it's determined by genetics largely, and you can't help the development of certain things. You cannot help the development of mental illness, or you can't help the development of an autoimmune disease, and it's just genetic. There's nothing much we can do. Well, for me, that's a very disempowering narrative. And so I think it's very much been the one thing I've been really interested in, and one of the reasons why I studied anthropology was I was curious about how do I counter some of these narratives, because it feels like a monolith. Like, how do you counter something so big, right? When the world around you is reflecting a perception, and saying, this is how the world is, this is how humans are, this is how experience is. To be able to determine that for yourself is a feat, really, to say, like, what, I'm going to actually try to do this a different way. I don't even know what that way is going to look like. But I think this is really what a lot of us are I think this is what's happening right now. There's a huge revolution right now, I think. And I think embodiment is playing a big role, and somatics is playing a huge role in transforming a narrative we've had about how we are in our bodies for so long. This very this idea that the body is a vehicle for the brain and only that, and that, this whole Cartesian dualism, this mind-body dualism, all of those things are being transformed, I think, now. But for most of us, we didn't grow up that way. We grew up in a culture that had very particular ideas about what it meant to have a body, and what it meant to even be a human in that body, and what it meant to have a certain kind of experience as a man or as a woman. And yeah, so those kinds of topics are always really interesting to me to kind of dig into and unpack and see the cultural and historical specificity of how ideas, really how ideas evolve over time. I studied some ideas all the way back to the ancient Near East. I used to study ancient Near Eastern history. I studied Akkadian and Sumerian. And I don't know that I was so conscious about it, but at the time I think it was really about wanting to understand how certain ideas about ourselves evolved. And seeing them that way helps. It's liberating to see that ideas are not inherent or innate to who we are. There are things that evolve, and because they evolve, they can change.
And so, Karine, I have another question for you. Many of the things you evoked today, I guess, apply to parenting in general. And yet you made the choice deliberately to work with mothers specifically. So I wonder, is there anything around this cultural dimension, this patterning and conditioning that you're particularly passionate about that sparked this choice for you?
To work with mothers?
Yes.
I think that's a very good question, partly because I keep getting a lot of feedback that the mothers I work with are like, hey, the dads want to know too. And, a lot of good friends of mine who are men and who are fathers are like, hey, over here. And I absolutely agree. I think it's for everyone. There's no question the kind of work, there's absolutely no question. But yeah, I think that, I think perhaps a lot of the work that I did came out of recognizing as well. I really am an admirer of Bethany Webster's work. She has her work around healing the mother wound. And, there's a very special dynamic between a mother and a daughter that's really embedded in culture and history. And I think, Bethany talks about this mother wound that exists within culture, and the denial of the feminine and the denial of the female, and how it's had these very negative repercussions in terms of how women come to value their own lives, and how this devaluation is so embodied and it's so unseen in very deep levels. And I was very inspired by that work, and I found it because I realized already that there was so much to do in my own experience between, having to do with my relationship with my own mother. And I think the only thing that was missing for me in Bethany's work was this embodiment piece. How do you then, you recognize that, you might recognize it, then how do you work with that, right? How do you actually begin to disentangle your voice, for example, from your mother's voice? How do you then create a new legacy from maybe a line of a lineage of maybe women who'd been wounded, culturally, historically for so long. Even the birth narrative is a great example of this. The medicalization of the birth experience is so rooted in history. You can go back hundreds of years and see how this process was taken over completely. And I think we even lost. We don't even realize just how much this process has led us to not trusting something very fundamental to who we are, and really knowing and believing in that. So, yeah, I think I just felt that I had an ability to speak to women and to mothers because of my experience that may be more potent than in a way I could talk to a man. And I hope and believe that there are also resources for men out there, But yeah, I think it was just much more based on that I chose to work with women.
Listening to you, Karine, I get a sense intuitively that there may be some potentially social and even political implications to the work of supporting women and mothers reconnect to their body. What would you say about that?
I mean, there's no question. I think when women can heal so deeply and so fundamentally, I have this very deep belief that if we have this ripple effect, of course, out into the world, there's no way that we can make such positive changes and not have it positively impact the world around us, not just through our children, but in how we relate to the whole of our lives, the ability to step up and step forward and step out onto the world stage, right? This for many women is so scary. We're so used to this idea, and I think this is also stemming from early experiences of playing small and being small and not being seen and not standing up and not having our voice heard. I know that experience so well. It could transform the world to have women step more into their power. There's no question. So many of the women I work with as well, so many women that I work with as well are, especially in the United States, I don't know the numbers for Europe, but there are so many who are depressed, who have a depression diagnosis, who are taking antidepressants. And I swear almost all of the women I've worked with who are on antidepressants also struggle to feel their anger. They struggle to connect with this very, this very animal part of their physiology that is meant to mobilize them. And in healthy ways, it would mobilize them to use their voice and to speak out and to say, no, I don't like that. No, stop doing that. No, that's not okay. We have this learned way, or this learned behavior of staying small and not using our voice. So this work, in my mind, no doubt has the potential to transform the culture that we live in, absolutely, and have it be less of necessarily of a patriarchy. I'm not wedded to that word, but I do see how, of course, there are definite ways that, our culture has been shaped in and dominated in many respects by a male perspective. And I think that a woman stepping up into her power, we're going to balance things out a little bit more. And I think this is an advantage for men too. Bethany talks about a lot about that as well, which is really, really interesting, how healing the mother wound heals everyone. It's beautiful, in my opinion. I think it's important work for all of us.
Mm-hmm. I would have a question for you, maybe addressed to all mothers who are listening to this podcast right now. If there was one practice that involves the body that you would advise them to try out, what would that be?
I'll give you my favorite all-time practice. I really think this is, there's so many you could draw from, but, at a time in my life, I actually went through a pretty severe postpartum depression. And I do that a little bit in quotations because I think it was much more to do with this, some trauma resurfacing. But when I paid attention to the body, what I was drawn to was anything that would connect my feet to the earth. So really, it's a very, very simple practice that people can use, is to bring awareness to their feet. Notice how the feet are making contact with the ground, feeling the soles of your feet. I would say even better, if you can, when it's not wintertime, or if you're in Australia, is to go outside and put your bare feet in the grass. I'm not joking when I say that that's one of the most powerful grounding practices I have ever used in my life. And it's had sometimes very, very significant impact on me when I was feeling a moment of anxiety. So as a regular practice, it can be a wonderful way of just grounding your energy again.
Thank you. And I know that on the web, you also host, at least on Facebook, a community of women who want to support themselves and maybe to support other females to work on all of that. Would you like to say a word around this?
Sure. Well, I have a community on Facebook now called Fixity to Flow. And it's just getting going now. So there's not a lot of activity, but it's coming. It's starting more and more now. But the other resource would be the podcast, the Bold as Love podcast. I would love if people tuned in. I have a lot I'd love to share with people there.
What's the link of that website?
That's KarineBell.com. That's KarineBell.com.
Thank you, Karine. Well, Karine, it was definitely a joy having you today on the Embodiment podcast. Certainly, we will post the links to all your upcoming offers and resources under the page of the podcast. And maybe over to you for one last word, anything you would want to share with regard to everything we discussed today.
I would just say, know thyself. Really, you don't, I think when we come to know ourselves, we come to know our lives and relate to our lives in a new way, everything else falls in place.
Thank you, Karine, and all the best for your future projects.
Thank you, Maud, so much.
Some ways to get more, to give back, and to get more involved now. So the biggest request I have would be to share the podcast with your friends, people that you think would really enjoy it. Email it to them, put it on your social media, tell them about it, old school. Really appreciate that. Equally, if you want to support us financially, you can go to Patreon. That's patreon.com/embodiment podcast and give us $1 an episode. And I'd say they're well worth $1. So that's less than £1 if you're in UK-ish. So yeah, please go there. On the embodiedfacilitator.com website is where this is hosted. If you're, most people I think listen to for iTunes. iTunes, we'd certainly appreciate a review. The way iTunes works means that a review means more people will find it. iTunes regards it as more important for searches. So even a couple of sentences review really does help as a little thank you to us. And if you want to go to embodiedfacilitator.com, you can see the actual, links to the sites. There's comments on there. The Facebook group tends to be where people discuss things. So if you go to put in the Embodiment podcast into Facebook, there's a page which is relatively quiet and a group which does have some discussion on. So I will reply to things personally there. So also on embodiedfacilitator.com website, there's all sorts of freebies there. There's videos, there's free ebooks, there's ebooks you can buy. And of course, there's our newsletter list. If you want to stay in touch and learn about things like the Embodied Facilitator course and our next Embodied Yoga Principles teacher training, then go to that website and you'll see a little pop-up and you can get the newsletter through there. Okay, so I think they're the main ones. Tell your friends, pay us some money on Patreon, give us a review on iTunes, send us your email if you want to be on the newsletter list, and get involved on the Facebook there. Bit long. Pick whatever you like that works for you.
Till next time, welcome home to the body.